Hey everyone, and welcome to SkillCapped. I'm TheKingLive, and today we're going to be breaking down one of the lesser talked about topics in Valorant, and that is the stages of the game. Specifically, what I want to talk about is the mid-game in Valorant, because a lot of players maybe don't process that every round has all three of these stages of it involved. But if this is something new to you, don't worry, we're going to break it all down for you today, starting from the early game all the way to the end game, just like the Avengers. So if you too want to be like Thanos, stick with us as we get into it, or if you don't want to be like Thanos, stick with us. Guys, please, just stick with us. I don't want to be left alone. But before we get into it, let's introduce our question of the day, which is, which Valorant agent do you think would make the best Avenger? Breach is probably the closest agent to a superhero in Valorant, or a supervillain. I guess it's all just perspective, but let me know what you think in the comments down below. Let's start out with, what are the stages of the game? Well, just as in most games, there are generally what we call the early game, the mid game, and the end game. The early game is generally the beginning of the game. In a battle royale, that would be when you're choosing your drop location, grabbing your first pieces of loot, or probably determining where to go. Now, I know that some of you are probably going to comment how in battle royales, your early game is also your end game, so I figured I beat you to the punchline, but you were also correct in saying that. The thing is, there's not really a designated time on when the early game, mid game, or end game takes place. It really just depends on how fast you choose to transition into these phases. And you do this every single round in Valorant, by the way. But why these things are important is because generally your end game's outcome is determined and heavily influenced by your early game or your mid game decisions. For example, during the early game in Valorant, your main goal should be to gather information. However, a lot of players just sort of throw all of this out the window and decide to 5-man push a random site. However, when you do this, you basically decided, hey, we're going to skip the early game and go straight to the mid game so we can get the bomb down and hit the end game. The problem here being, you didn't gather any info. You don't know if pushing that site is the correct decision. You don't know if they're playing 5 players there. You haven't blown any utility from the enemies. This could be incredibly risky, and it's generally not the most consistent way to win games. Because some games pushing C site every round might work, and some games it might not. But you know what will prevail most times? Taking your time, gathering info, and making a decision based off of that. You have 100 seconds to make a decision in every round. I suggest using it. Now we're going to start breaking down each stage of the game in depth, but if you guys are really looking to improve, I highly suggest you check out our hyper improvement system on SkillCapped.com. We can teach you how to play any agent proficiently, as well as we also have Smurf commentaries where a higher ranked player will walk you through how to carry in your rank, and we have lineups too. So if this sounds like something you might be interested in, be sure to check it out in the link below. It's also backed by our rank improvement guarantee, so if you don't feel like you've gotten benefit out of it, it's literally no risk. All that available on skillcapped.com, so be sure to check it out. So what takes place in the early game though? Well, like I said, this is the very beginning stage of the game. Even parts like the buy phase could be considered part of the early game, communicating what strats are going to take place, what site we're going to push, am I going to drone, stuff like that. This stuff is important, a lot more important than people think, and AFKing during the buy phase generally isn't a good idea. We've probably all had those rounds where maybe you forgot to buy, or somebody on your team was asking for a buy and we didn't hear them, so they just have a classic for the round. That stuff sucks, and it can be avoided if people just paid attention during the early game. The early game isn't just the buy phase though, it's also the start of the game where you begin gathering info. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes this process is faster than others. Like if your teammate just goes and peeks mid and gets opt right away, he may have gathered info in a bad way, but he definitely gathered info. Generally, the early game is going to include any defaults taking place. Defaults commonly are things players will do at the start of a round to create pressure and help them safely take control of areas. Some things I like to do in the early game would be like focusing on grabbing ultimate orbs, maybe looking for the location of a specific enemy player, or baiting out utility so they don't have as much later to stop our pushes. If they have an operator, try to safely locate the operator. If they have a sentinel player, try to find out where that sentinel is playing. If you're on defense, generally your early game is going to be to attempt to figure out where the enemy is pushing. Maybe you're taking control of hookah and you're just trying to hold that, create pressure. Notice how I haven't talked about any kills being had yet though. Mostly you're just gathering info so far, attempting to take control of territory or denying info. Now also during the early game, something we can talk about is a tactic called playing for picks. This is something you may hear often in Valorant, and generally what playing for picks refers to is the process of analyzing how the enemy team is playing and trying to figure out the easiest way that you can get an early pick to start out the round. Lots of players believe that playing for picks just means to spread out, but this is not entirely true. For example, a way I like to look for picks on bind is if I notice the enemy has a habit of peeking B long, I will say, hey, this guy really likes to solo peek B long, let's go double swing him and play for that pick. Generally, if the team is going to play for picks, I would suggest having a goal in mind. Where are you going to look for picks? Because if everyone on your team is going to walk around alone and not communicate anything, you're probably going to be the ones who are getting picked. Instead, try to use the buddy system. Stick together and look for picks together. Remember friends, strength in numbers. Now, around the time after you get your first pick or two, this is generally where the mid-game is going to start taking place. This is the portion of the game where you're going to be making the decision of where your team wants to go. What are you going to do in this round? Sometimes your mid-game is going to be really garbage. Sometimes you're going to lose 2 players at the start of the round and have to make the decision of, all right, we have 3 players left, let's try to push the nearest site and just try to get the bomb down. Sometimes your mid-game is going to be a little bit healthier and you'll have more options. Maybe you were the ones who got a pick in the early game, and because of that, you can either decide to push that site or anticipate a rotate and hit the other site. The mid-game is really going to depend mostly on what options you have available to you. If you have any ultimates available, you can probably start to prepare to use those. Generally, you don't want to use your ultimates in the early game because, as we said before, you don't have a ton of information to work with, so it can be a little harder to get guaranteed value out of it. Another thing to keep in mind is that if you try to use your ultimates to initiate onto a site and you haven't spent time baiting out utility, there's a large likelihood that they will be able to halt your push with smokes, mollies, grenades, shock darts, basically just any ability that they can spam into you might cause your push to fail. This is a big reason I don't suggest using Killjoy ultimate as a rush ultimate. Lots of players just say things like, hey, I'm going to Killjoy ult B, let's just go B. You have to recognize this ultimate takes time to work its magic, and in this time the enemies can often stall until it goes off, at which point you have gotten very little value out of it. Using these abilities too early can often be a waste. Generally, if you give the round time, your options will start to open up and you can figure out what the best decision is in that moment. However, your primary goal as an offense during the mid-game should be to figure out which site you want to push and how to initiate that push. This is the part of the game where you've collected all of that information from the early game and are beginning to act on it. Now, as I said earlier, the mid-game and the end game are heavily influenced by the early game. If you gather a lot of information and bait out a ton of utility during the early game, your mid-game is going to be a lot easier, which will lead to an easier end game. However, if you decide not to gather any info and just initiate a push onto a random site, your early game was a lot weaker, and that's going to make your mid game just a little bit more difficult. Now, after you've initiated your push and are planning the spike, this is going to be the start of the end game. Obviously, however successful your mid game was, it's going to largely influence how the end game plays out. Because if you lose 3 players while pushing onto site, you're now in a 2v3, it's going to be a bit harder to hold for that post plant. However, if you had a very successful push and only lost 1 player, now it's a 4v2, that's going to be awesome and make their end game more difficult. Obviously, if the attacker's endgame is playing post plant, the defender's endgame would be playing this retake. And keep in mind, as a defender, it's not uncommon to intend to play for retake. It's awesome if you're able to keep the enemy team off site and prevent the bomb plant, but it's not always possible, and you might want to play as if intending to get a pick and then let them in to play for retake. Retaking is a big part of the game. It's okay if you have to retake. A lot of players start to panic when they hear the bomb going down, and I think it would be really helpful for players to recognize that's okay, the bomb's going to go down, let's play for retake and coordinate our utility. Now, as we mentioned earlier, at the end of the mid-game and during the endgame are generally when the ultimates are going to be used. Stuff like Breach Ultimate is generally used to initiate onto a site, whereas stuff like Sova's Ultimate or Viper's Ultimate are generally used during a post plant. The cool thing about Valorant is the way the game is structured, this is generally the climax that everything builds up to. The game is literally built in a way that is supposed to make these moments that just feel intense and exciting, and they can happen literally every round when the game is played correctly. Oftentimes, teams won't actually make it all the way to this sort of endgame. Sometimes the spike won't even end up going down, but that will normally result in a different type of endgame. Whether it's an intense 1v1 where players are just duking it out or trying to outbrain each other, or it's an incredibly boring 5v1 because one team failed during the early/mid game, that's generally how the game is played out. But that brings me to the big thing that I mentioned earlier, but it's the most important part of this video, so I'm going to say it again. How good of an endgame you have in each round is directly influenced by how good of an early and mid game you have. If you play lazy in the early game, you're going to have less information to work off of, which is going to hurt your mid game. And if you have a rough mid game, you're not going to have very many bodies for post plant, which in the end is going to really harm your ability to defend a site or retake a site. Try your best not to get lazy throughout the round and use all of the information and tools available to you. And don't forget about the ultimates you have available. So many players sit on their ultimate for rounds on end, and you should be using those whenever you have them available. But most importantly, remember, if you want to improve your KDA, win more gunfights, and get the rank that you've always wanted, you should really consider checking out SkillCapped.com. Link in the description below. I hope this guide was helpful for you. It's definitely something I haven't really heard any guides talk about, so maybe you learned something today. I have a lot of fun making these guides for you, so if you enjoyed this type of stuff, be sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel down below. It really does help us out. And if you have a friend who maybe you think could benefit from this guide, feel free to send it their way as well. My hope is one by one we can help the Valorant community improve at the game, so if you wanted to help us out with that, that's one way you can do that. Also, don't forget to answer our question of the day, which was, which Valorant agent do you think would make the best Avenger? Would love to hear your replies in the comments down below. As always, I'm TheKingLive, and we here at SkillCapped want to thank you all for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.